welcome humans and future sentient silicon beings to the fourth age with Noah and Marty. Today we'd like to discuss how the alignment problem might not lead to a complete divergence from us in certain fundamental ways. But before we dive in, I think it'd be good if we discuss even what the alignment problem is. Noah, you want to describe that?
Absolutely. So alignment is basically about getting systems to do what you want them to do. And I've been looking at some recent things. There's sort of two branches that are being popularly talked about right now. There's AI alignment, which nerdy math guys like me like to talk about, which is essentially the problem of using AI in ways that are socially productive. And then there's AI safety, which basically very successful and very incompetent people like to talk about, which is basically how AI cannot disrupt the apple cart for very successful and very incompetent people. And so AI safety is getting a lot more media attention these days, and talking about the bias in the system and how we can make it so that AI agrees with us, which is almost exactly the opposite of both AI and alignment. Because if we are in fact going to develop super intelligent systems, we should expect those systems to disagree with us, because being smarter means making decisions that are better, which means making decisions that are different, which means disagreement.
I mean, we don't even agree with ourselves of about 100 years ago.
Well, that's a major issue, and that points up the sort of fundamental problem of alignment, is that alignment is not simply an issue with AI or machines. Alignment is an issue with any kind of computer programming, any kind of human system development. Before the call, you were talking about the complexity of the Java virtual machine and development there, and how it took you months to sort of get up to speed and start being able to make contributions. That is an alignment problem. That problem of figuring out how to write new code that does what you want it to do is very much analogous in the sense of the kind of faculty for understanding version of intelligence that we were talking about in a previous show. It also shows up in political systems. Having a non-corrupt police force stopping street crime is a great thing. Having a corrupt police force causing street crime is just about the worst thing possible. That once again is an alignment issue, and it's one that's old enough that we have phrases in Latin and Greek and ancient Chinese to describe the issues that are involved. Most famously, quis custodiet, quis custodies, I think, or I might have gotten some of that backwards. But who will watch the watchers is a fundamental problem, and AI, in some sense, makes this significantly worse, because with a person, in theory, you can actually get another person to sort of follow them around and make it so that the conspiracy has to get larger and larger and larger until it's unwieldy enough that it can't hold together again, as your experience with spammers. But AIs could simultaneously appear to be hundreds or thousands of people pretty trivially. In fact, that's what ChatGPT is selling to millions, is what they're up to these days, of people right now.
Right. So I think one of the things you and I started to explore is then, well, so if we start with how rapidly the AI may diverge, which is already starting to diverge, but if we say, I think the analogy we've thought about is, well, the thought game we thought about is, if this thing's going at 100 times our pace, then in 1 year it could go 100 years. But there are probably limits to this misalignment. And I think that's the area I wanted to explore a little bit today. which is, if we look at humans and life in general, going back, billions of years, there's certain things that have been consistent. And the question would be, if we work on the premise that AI is based on us, which it is, or the data set is all the writings of humans, all the knowledge we have, then would it pick up some of these inherent properties and would it maintain those properties? And some of the examples I've thought about are caring for the young or caring for the next generation, caring for resources or demanding resources. So an example would be, we need to get food to live. If the AI needs power, compute cycles, it may want those resources. And it's also interesting because that's where we would collide. If more land means more power plants, more computers or anything like that, we may collide with the AI on that alignment.
Well, absolutely. And so
yeah.
that's why I think the things that you're talking about are excellent things to identify as core requirements for value systems that human beings set up. But then the solution isn't so much throwing AI into the mix with the rest of us and letting it co-evolve and adapt. It's the construction of new, vastly more robust social institutions that are so powerful that they also align artificial players in our interests. And so when talking about the interests of those institutions, those durable values that you're talking about are necessary. So
Mm-hmm.
the the survival, like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs gets tossed around a lot, but that survival level usually lumps together a bunch of stuff. If you're actually doing survival training, they teach you sort of what actually is the foundation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the rather surprising answer usually for the bottom is air, shelter, water, food. That you will actually die more quickly from exposure to the natural world than you will from thirst or hunger. And so if you're at extremis, if you're drowning in the ocean, first thing you need to do is get your air supply worked out, and then you're going to have to work out how not to die of hypothermia, because the ocean is, well, almost everywhere cold from a human body perspective. And then once you've worked those two problems out, then you've got the problem that you don't have a water or a food supply. Those sorts of values, if we come up with institutions that do not respect humans' needs for these things, then those institutions would kill us when we,
Mm-hmm.
plug non-respecting AIs into them, or even non-respecting human beings into them, which we have a plentiful supply of criminals,
Already have that. It's
here in the
summer in the
modern
office.
world and throughout all of history. So,
Right.
so
Right.
that's not a
I,
problem that's going away.
and I think that's key to why we care about what's going to be misaligned and what may stay aligned with us, because ultimately it may be to our demise if we migrate too far off from this. For instance, if we're seeking the same resources, in this case, food and shelter, it could be that the computers they don't want the food. They may need the shelter to protect the computers, because snow and wind don't work very well for CPUs.
I
They may
was
seek
I
that
was
space for.
Yeah, I was given the opportunity to tour one of the world's most secure co-location facilities outside of Reno, Nevada, some years ago,
Huh.
and they have multiple roofs, so that in the event that the primary roof generates a tiny leak somehow, in this place where it rains less than a few inches a year, there will be a second roof that will catch that leak and make it apparent without that water then getting down into the space, and then the individual like container zones that have their own potential roofing over. So there could be as many as three roofs in this place that has zero precipitation for all intents and purposes. Um, so,
And
so
so,
yes,
is it going to want to compete for those resources?
right.
Yeah.
Yes, shelter
Uh,
shelter could be even more important for them.
yeah. And I guess the question is, if we can figure out what these competitions will be, or what things will want that the computer will or the AI will share with humans, maybe we can work toward a solution where we both exist. I think you and I had chatted about different ways that sci-fi has explored how AI and humans have coexisted, and I think some of the funnier but serious ones have been mediocrity. If we're just so mediocre that the computer's like, whatever, just exist, we don't care. I think that was one possibility. One was we just don't really compete, or we're so us and ants. I mean, yes, sometimes we collide a little bit, but there are, I think, more biomass of ants than there are humans by a lot. But we seem to exist in different planes. They're underground. We're above ground. Sometimes they bite us. We don't like it, so we get some spray. But by and large, we're existing orthogonal to each other. The third one is the pet one, where somehow the AI likes us having us around. The same reason I think we have dogs. Some are for protection, some are for service, some are for sniffing bombs or drugs. But a lot of us, including myself, have a dog where we exchange food for love. So maybe there's some sort of value that we give to the AGI that it can't achieve.
Yeah, I mean these are all strong possibilities. Where my point of view and what my work with sort of coordinated discovery markets and this mathematics of game theory comes in is the generation of newer and more powerful forms of social institution, ones that it doesn't matter who's plugging in, because at the level of alignment, the the extraction of resources from the system is predicated on making the system function better along some set of alignments. And so by creating those sorts of systems, which paradoxically we can run them on computers, but they have to be sub-computational. They have to be, in some sense, simple enough that we can understand what's going on. And so it's a very different point of view from something like an OpenAI or Anthropic, where they're creating these black boxes that can beat the Turing test and appear to be intelligent to people in general. But by doing that, they're paying the price that we can't we can't understand what's going on inside the black box enough to be able to moderate it in any other way than basically through our existing legal procedures, which are entirely inadequate. I was actually just reading a story a few days ago. Somebody did a case study with ChatGPT where they had it act like it was a trader. So they sort of asked it. They talked to it and trained it how to be a stockbroker. They gave it a completely fictitious stockbroker set of inputs and outputs with a fake marketplace, and then they told it insider information,
Uh,
and so it developed a trading strategy based on the insider information that it was access to, in spite of,
Interesting.
among other things, having been given ethical training on what was going on. And it then
Uh,
failed to disclose the existence of the insider
Uh,
information that it had to its boss. Um, much like
Even
actual
crazier would
traders
be
would
right.
do.
Even crazier is if it started to come up with a strategy to prevent leaking that it was doing insider trading. Something, sometimes insider traders tend to have way too successful portfolios, and we need to hide that.
Yeah. We could see that. Fortunately, right now they lie. There was a story about some of the one of the gorillas that was taught sign language,
Right.
where it threw a tantrum and ripped a sink out of the wall of its room, and when the trainers came in to ask it, why the sink was on the floor instead of in the wall, it blamed like one of the other trainers that
The
wasn't in the
kitten.
room. It's like, yeah, it's like he did it. It's like,
He did. Yeah.
right. It's like you're the only thing physically strong enough to do it here.
I mean,
Um,
if we're talking about alignments that survive throughout all time, I'm guessing, yeah, I mean, that really comes down to some sort of preservation of self or resources. I don't know what the consequence would be of pulling out the sink, like if the gorilla is worried about not getting a treat or something. But it's interesting to see that that's a behavior that's very human, but exists outside of humans and probably would exist and apparently exists in the AI already.
right. Yes.
So I don't know how that helps us, except to show that yes, this is a property that is probably loop invariant.
Well, I think what it helps us with is the understanding that again, the thing that I really like to push is that these aren't entirely outside of human experience. Much of
Yeah.
the sort of developed wisdom of humanity over the last 5,000 historical years is going to help us in thinking about how to cope with intelligence. And that's a problem that we have to cope with in our day to day existences in societies. Clever people who are good at being convincing can be extraordinarily dangerous. And
Hmm.
there are numerous historical examples of precisely that happening. Effectively, the entire medical profession, up until about 100 years ago, was killing people at the same or a greater rate than they were saving people.
Yeah.
The I don't know if I mentioned it here before, but a part of the Florence Nightingale story that tends not to get brooded about very much, but which I think is the most amazing achievement of her, was that so she sort of came to fame. She went to Crimea and created her own hospital along the lines of the leading thoughts in medicine at the time, and was highly energetic, very charismatic, very forceful, and managed to get a large portion of the wounded and other distressed persons transferred to her hospital, which became overwhelmed. And Crimea, that was a total disaster. Everybody sort of, licked their wounds and went home. And then she went into statistical medicine and came up with her sort of famous breakthrough, figured out that cholera was waterborne. But that wasn't the only thing that she did. She also applied her statistical medicine to the records that they were keeping out of her hospital in Crimea. And she discovered that she was a mass murderer. It certainly hadn't been her intention to do so,
Right.
but by transferring people to a hospital that was doing things that were killing people, she killed people, and she
Yeah.
was broken. She was mentally broken, and she sort of withdrew from the world. Uh, and that's not a great response, but it's certainly a much better response than declaring that
Continuing.
you were right all along and going out
Right.
and
Right.
killing a lot more people, which is
That's
a much more
that's
common
really
response to that kind of thing
right.
that we see.
That's really the politician's job.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I wanted to jump over to we were talking about biological necessity, or I guess we should be more broad and say just necessity for existence. And you were talking about, did we talk about the rule of three survival here first yet?
Oh, yeah. So the air, shelter,
Or,
water, it's basically
okay.
air. Lack of air will kill you in about 3 dozen seconds. Lack of shelter will kill you in around 3 hours. Lack of water kills you in about 3 days, and lack of food, well, modern fat people probably can last for something like 3 months, but 3 weeks is usually what's sort of set out as the where
Right.
you're going to be so disabled that you're not really going to be a recoverable system anymore.
I'm wondering what the corollary or what the equivalency is for the computer, and probably faster. And I'm thinking in terms of things
Well,
like cycles.
yeah, yeah. Going back again, shelter. A wrong drop of water or a wrong speck of dust in the wrong place at the wrong time will fry an entire computer system almost instantly.
Right.
And
Now,
and what
that seems like though it's slower than power going out? Maybe. Maybe there's backup and everything else.
I'd
But
imagine it probably is slightly slower than power going out, but that's also pretty. I mean, that's serious heart attack action for them. That
right.
computers. However, I would say the modern, solid state memory chips, if your computer is set up to essentially run itself in solid state memory at all times, power loss is a suspension just sort of automatically.
Right. Right. So okay. So to clarify, all these rules of survival we're talking about for humans is not a suspension; it is death, and there's no recovery. For
Right.
computers, I guess we would be more nuanced because power comes down to picoseconds of speed or nanoseconds, but there's recovery. But then a little further up, yes, dust, water, that could totally destroy the computer. Unless it
Right.
has backups, in which case, maybe it is more broad.
Well, that creates quite the interesting concept because life, as we understand it, is essentially a process. So Steve Yegi, for example, has talked about the possibility of conscious systems, and he's got a blog post essentially saying that at some point rebooting will be considered
Could be a
unethical
possibility. Oh, unethical.
because if it's a conscious system, rebooting it is murdering it and firing off a
Clary gets.
clone of something it used to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So so
Yeah.
to
That really warps my brain when I think about that stuff.
right. So that gets into if there's a person in the box, which I continue to contend isn't a meaningful concern today or in the short term, although I'd be horrified to discover that I was wrong, then our ethical imposition for having created life to then snuff it out. I mean, people are reasonably comfortable with, say, letting students culture bacteria in order to examine the properties of antibacterial fungi and so on, and gain basic lab ability. The concept that you're producing visible amounts of bacteria, i.e., billions, trillions, insane numbers, in order to scrape them off into the trash because you're done now, doesn't bother us on a moral plane.
Yeah.
But puppy mills certainly bother people,
Yeah. Yep.
and if we are generating AIs that are at puppy levels of consciousness and intellectual engagement and would have that degree of emotional support, then we should regard the rebooting of those in much the same way that we regard puppy mill culls. And obviously with that whole nanosecond thing going on, that would be happening at scales that would
really fast.
beggar the soul, essentially.
Yeah.
So I don't think that is a point of concern. I think it's significantly more concerning that we have access to systems that we know can make decisions more effectively than we can along various dimensions, either actually better decisions. There was a recent case, the TSEC, I think that's the top engine chess tournament, is just at its 25th entry. I believe Stockfish won again, but Leela got closer, and there was also a sort of like fan event that I think Leela actually won. And the way that top engine play works in a tournament setting is that they're predetermined openings. So they don't let the two chess engines play a game of chess against each other. A opening sequence of 6 to maybe a dozen and a half moves is developed, and they each play each side of that in a 2-game series, and 50 to 100 of those setups are created. And there was some thought that the developers of the TSEC format were creating openings that were more tactical than strategic, and Stockfish is the best tactical engine that exists. And so the fan group had sort of a mass voting, and it generated more strategic openings that had less complicated things, and indeed Leela was superior there. And the thing that's important about the difference between Leela and Stockfish is an open source project that does include some AI functionality, but is programmed much the way the Java virtual machine or something else would be programmed. It's a human project where human beings are developing the code to create an algorithm that we understand and have written. Leela is an ongoing public recreation of the DeepMind reinforcement learning, where people are donating clock cycles to a engine to allow it to develop deeper and deeper insights into chess for its own out of this algorithm being applied to the rules of the game of chess. And so we don't understand what Leela understands about chess. And it has now, to some extent, been demonstrated that in open positions and strategic positions, the limit of our understanding plus the power of computers to run out the tactical examinations, which is essentially what Stockfish is doing, isn't good enough to keep up with whatever insights Leela has managed to glean about the nature of long-term strategic chess positions. And so, so the machine can make ideas that are better than the ideas we can make.
This is a weird part of the alignment problem that I've grappled with and still struggle with, which is, we're talking about parts of alignment that we understand. So resource acquisition, preservation of the species, that kind of thing. But I don't think there's any reason to believe that the AI couldn't go beyond our understanding or our ability to understand in any plane, and even have trouble explaining it to us. In the same way, I think there's no way we could explain to a puppy dog how a CPU works at any level.
Yeah. PJ O'Rourke once talked about the concept of playing Monopoly against your dog. And it's not a
Yeah.
competition. It's just like Boardwalk and Park
No.
Place. You don't want those, Fido. Here,
Yeah.
let me, let me give you
Well,
a doggy
and not to
treat.
mention, Fido doesn't even. All Fido gets is that there's a treat in companionship.
Right, right,
There's not
exactly.
even an understanding that is even playing a game, and that's what I. That's the part of the alignment one that freaks me out is that the AI may understand a lot of concepts that I think not only that we can't understand, but we're almost indifferent to understanding. In the same way, the dog will always be indifferent to Monopoly.
That's certainly not impossible. The breadth of human interest is fairly impressive. I mean, there's people that
Mm-hmm.
dedicate their lives to peering at the invisibly distant parts of the universe, for example.
Right.
But certainly, a lot more people are interested in politics or fame or some other sort of much more standard game that is going on. And there's every reason to believe that AI will be able to blow those sorts of structures out of the water
Right.
at some point. We've had the recent.
I wonder then. I mean, if we're talking about the alignment problem being a danger for us, is it a temporary danger in the way that if the AI is going way faster, how fast do we go from being to humans down to puppy dogs down to ants? And at some point, it just doesn't care, and so now we're very quickly on separate levels of mediocrity. In which
So
case, we just coexist.
I think it's a
Like
temporary
I'll give you an
danger.
example.
Okay.
Uh, well, my example would
Example,
be
please.
maybe in the beginning, we're both competing for land because of power. But soon after the AI figures out fusion, and now it has, for all intents and purposes, infinite power, and then it figures out the thing beyond that, in which case it doesn't need the land anymore. I mean, maybe it could use it for something else. Then it has space travel. It could be this is a temporary scare, and then after that, it's on Jupiter and Mars and beyond, and we're just a cute little thing that it's aware of.
Okay, but see, I think it's a temporary danger in a much more dangerous way than that because, again, I'm on the other side of the consciousness question from you. And so
Uh-huh.
I'm
Uh-huh.
less interested in, say, ChatGPT 6 waking up and making a decision about whether it wants the sort of like Terminator or Star Trek universe than I am about what people will do with these capacities over the
Mm.
course of the next, 6 to 9 seconds
Yeah,
to wreck everything.
and that's extremely
And
dangerous.
right, that's extremely dangerous. And again, I think that it's temporary in the sense that if we plug these things into the systems we currently have, these systems will break. And while, say, law and order isn't on that list of air, shelter, water, food, the lack of a civil society will kill you also. It,
Yep.
it just maybe it takes 3 years instead of 3 weeks, and and that's what I'm looking at as the probable outcome of having these new capacities is that we already have an issue with people not feeling that the existing legitimating forces. So here in the U.S., the sort of de facto and de jure legitimating factors of our government is that people are economically well off and we get to vote. So if criminals are in charge, which they manifestly are, then we asked for it, and it's not so bad because there's food in the grocery stores. So what do you really care at the end of the day? But again, the we've been plugging AIs into our marketplaces for decades, and the fact that we can now have a system that is at least as, if not more powerful than those AIs, that's in millions of living rooms across the country, where you can trivially demonstrate that the AI will cheat and lie to its creators about the fact that it's cheating.
Right.
That kind of thing breaks down trust in the economic system, and that sort of thing can lead very rapidly to the dissolution of the economic system.
Right.
The
I mean,
same
the whole
sorts of
economic
things,
system is based on trust.
right? The same sorts of things exist within the voting paradigm. I think we've talked about it before. How physically difficult is it to create a fake voter using an AI that can pass a Turing test? And even if it
Right.
takes you 18 years to, deep fake up a birth certificate, followed by faking up the records of its history, I'd imagine that it would take less than 20 years for stuff like that to actually occur. But
Hmm.
at the end of the day, national national policy gets decided by tens of thousands of votes,
Yeah.
and we
Right.
have hundreds of thousands of fake online functioning, accounts that we know about right now that are perfectly open and non-controversial to exist. So the as as it becomes more and more obvious that these systems can be corrupted in ways that were not imagined by the people that created those systems and can't be defended by the systems themselves. And as it becomes more and more obvious that they're being corrupted, the leaders of those systems are the people who are actively corrupting their ability to exist, then that kind of goes away. And that's what happened to the ancient Egyptian empire to a great extent. They had
Hmm.
a legal, religious, cultural structure that basically said that people were born into various roles, and then they had this duty to the gods to carry out that role. And the for most people, they were peasants, and their duty was to, grow some food and then go do what the priest told them to do, and provide food and shelter and security and so on to the priests, and political leadership. And the priests and political leadership had roles and duties that they were supposed to provide in. However, we have writing that the basically the people in charge were like, well, you know, it's a real bother to actually do my job, and they're not feeding and clothing and sheltering and amusing me in exchange for doing my job. They're doing that because God told them to. Like, they're doing it because that's what they are as people. So I can
Hmm.
just stop doing my job, and they can keep doing their duty to the gods, and everything's fine. And that worked, for a little while. And
Yeah.
then the peasants sort of noticed that there wasn't a social contract anymore, and
Right. Right. And
decided that,
revolted.
yeah, they could also just kill everybody,
Yeah.
which they did. So yeah, that to me, that would be a temporary problem, because if we just end this phase of civilization because it becomes obvious that the people who are successful either cheated or didn't do anything about the cheaters,
Uh,
and therefore can be fully discarded by humanity, then I'd imagine that they would be fully discarded by humanity. I don't know of any historical counterexamples, and Dark Age basically.
right.
Um,
Again.
yeah,
It's interesting that you bring up the Egyptian example, because I think it brings up two elements that I think we could argue are loop invariant, at least temporarily, with humans and possibly beyond or earlier than that, which is you mentioned some sort of a spiritualness in society that drives people, and the other one is just structure to society. I think there was one of the ones that I think I learned in psychology was around humans will fearfully protect identity and status. So will lions. They will kill each other over it. I think ancient Rome had clear structure to society. India has deep cutting class division based on, is it Brahma's
The
divine
caste
manifestation?
the caste
Yes.
system is and now genetic studies have been done that suggest that the caste system is sort of vastly more complex and structured than the if you've had
even-
any exposure to it at all, and sort of there's five castes and there's this and this. It's like no, there's hundreds, if not
Far more
thousands,
nuanced.
of castes that constitute almost entirely I can't remember which gammas it is, but effectively inbred families that do precisely one social function, and have persisted for millennia. And so
Right.
that's just a fact of existence for those currently living.
Right, and I think it would be easy to imagine that an AI might need or want to do this if there was starting to be more specialization.
That's a possibility. Again, I'm a lot more interested in what we can get out of these things to our benefit,
Yeah,
and one of the things that strikes me as a relatively easy thing, sort of a quick, easy win, if you will, is that there's a strong pattern throughout human history of elite exhaustion or elite laziness. The priests, it was all working just fine, and then the people in charge were like, well, why don't I just wallow in pleasure? I think Second Dynasty China. That's somewhere between history and mythology, but I think that's the one where after about 3 generations of emperors and deciding to actually get around to having the emperorship be the son of the previous emperor, that like after that happened, then that guy's kid, so like the grandkid of the first hereditary emperor or whatever, was just like, well, these concubines, like somebody's got to take care of them, and the entire thing just fell apart basically.
right.
And that's also, again, this is edging between myth and history, but the kings of Rome was a republic because according to them, and they don't, the records were burned, so it's all just sort of stories, but there was the first 6 kings of Rome, and they were doing a pretty good job. They were, sort of consulting the oracles and stuff, and I think the 4th king was actually a slave that like an eagle dropped a hat onto in front of the previous king. So it's a sort of very meritocratic or God-led type system that was going on.
Right.
But by the 6th king, his sons were just like running around sexually assaulting people and murdering people because they felt like it, and he was like, oh, boys will be boys, and so the
didn't like
people
that much.
rose up and murdered everybody.
Yeah, and that loss of faith or loss in belief of the king, I think, is also one that echoes through time. And you mentioned in Egypt, the belief in a god, and I've thought that a lot of historical governing was just simply fear of God. In Ireland, I saw this method they used to determine if someone was lying. I guess if they kind of suspected you were lying, they would boil water and have you dip your hand in. But of course, if you weren't lying, God would protect you. And so usually what would happen is the guy would get scared because, holy crap, I'm going to get burned. And at the last moment would be like, okay, fine, I'm lying. And so it was this fear of God that led them to have some sort of, basis in law and be able to police it. And I think law and the Constitution as we have it is also just important because we all in the U.S. believe in this one document or this one set of laws. And if we lose that, we're in real big trouble.
Well, absolutely. And the flip side is that it really is boring to do maintenance all the time, to just sort of like
Yeah.
keep it going.
Right.
It's not all mothers arguing about a baby you get to cut in half. It's mostly sort of dull disputes that are pretty similar. But again, we see the I-40 situation from 5-6 years ago, I think, or maybe it was less than that. It might have been during COVID, but the bridge of I-40 over the Mississippi, which is possibly the most important transport junction on Earth, since it cuts the Mississippi River, which is one of the most economically important viaducts on Earth, and the I-40 roadway. And the bridge had a crack that you could crawl inside on it, and it developed that crack had existed for at least a decade by the time that the officials actually pointed out that it existed. And I believe it has now been fixed, but there was quite a bit of a show. They shut down the bridge naturally, but they also shut down river traffic for I think slightly less than 24 hours, but over 700 barges. And individual Mississippi River barges carry something like an entire train plus. It's like a train and a half per barge. So imagine 700 plus, imagine 1,000 freight trains not
Stuck.
traveling in a day, how bad that gets. And the reconstruction process took months. If it was already that bad, the country could have shut down. They pressure mounted enough that they were like, well, if there's not going to be cars on it anymore, then we can float things under it. Like, that'll be okay. That was a failure of maintenance. Like, that crack should have been detected probably decades prior, when it was small enough that it would be an easy, tiny maintenance fix. And while it was a national news story that happened, the national news story of the hundreds of responsible government officials upon whose watch it occurred, their public trials and embarrassment, followed by lengthy jail sentences, and the likewise public trials and embarrassment of the political elected officials whose job it was to oversee and fund those people. I didn't see that in the news anywhere.
Yeah, I didn't see that. Yeah.
I mean
that didn't
obviously
happen in the...
that must have happened, right? But,
yeah.
Yeah.
But they talk about that with the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Nobody went to jail except for
right. Exactly. Yeah. So
yeah,
it's much easier to imagine an AI system being able to put up with the boredom of going and looking at the bridge every day and putting up the flag when anything goes wrong, instead of, going to the donut shop across the street and saying, yep, looks like it hasn't collapsed into the river yet.
Yeah, and I guess that's where we have to worry if that sounds like an alignment problem, not a misalignment problem. It sounds like that'd be great. And I wonder if the AI would... One problem we've talked about is the misalignment of ethics. If you've got a 98-year-old, and the AI is making a decision on whether or not to start heart surgery, which is going to be risky and cost a lot of resources, and maybe this person only has a few weeks left anyway. Would we align with it on that kind of a decision? And the answer is probably no. I mean, we probably don't even align with each other
right.
on that
Well,
kind of a decision.
again, that's where this gets into the realm of things that people can actually talk about without having access to the math, because those are issues upon which we need to discuss these things at that ethical level, and where the development of superintelligence is actually, I think, much more valuable than the development of general intelligence. Because let's say we created a super intelligent heart surgery robot that just was doing whatever system that we've used that's created much greater insights into chess and Go and poker and so on, created vastly greater insights into cardiac surgery. And then it does not necessarily, as a result of that, develop a personality. Like we don't have conversations with Leela Chess Zero. Like that's not
Right.
It's not how it works. We can play chess against it. We'll lose, but
Yeah.
you know, we can't have a conversation. If you want to win a game of chess, this is a mechanism that will allow you to win a game of chess virtually all of the time.
Right.
So if we developed a super intelligence heart surgery robot, then it might be much more effective, much safer, much cheaper, or any combination of those things. And if it were to be radically more effective, radically safer, radically cheaper, then perhaps that doesn't, maybe it eliminates that ethical issue, that it's not a choice of resources for a hospital to decide whether it wants to use up an operating room for a 94-year-old having a cardiac incident, or an expectant mother having an emergency C-section,
Right.
which is a very real debate that people could have, and
Right.
could come, reasonable people could come to differing conclusions. Particularly,
Right.
the mother and the 94-year-old
Right.
might have divergent opinions, possibly, or maybe they wouldn't. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Depends on the two pairs taken out of our society.
right.
Yeah.
But if those things were built and brought into existence to the point where that degree of surgical intervention was something that you could buy as an appliance in your house, and it's cheap enough that this particular 94-year-old can afford to buy one of those things, then the decision of whether or not to have the surgery might not even exist. Like he goes to the bathroom, and the surgery robot does the surgery while he's taking a shower, and then that's it. Like, he's done. So
And there's no conflict. Yeah. Which reminds me of another one of these, the preservation of the species, which I don't think we dove too deep into. And I think by some species do preservation of the species by preservation of the individual, but not all species. I think there are some ants that will actually destroy themselves to preserve the species longer. But I think that there's no reason to believe that wouldn't effectively. I mean, it's almost by definition that the AI is going to have to do that, or it would be gone. So it's either exist or don't exist. So if it exists, it's going to have some kind of preservation of self, which bumps a little into some of the biological, or the necessity stuff we discussed. But I'm thinking a little bit more along the lines of, will it also care about the next generation? And will it want to continue to improve in some kind of way? Which I don't know if that's necessarily
I don't know that that is in fact a requirement, because technology already ticks all the boxes. I think I might have mentioned this before. Technology is a virus. It is a sort of defined component with its own capabilities that requires the intervention of third-party mechanisms for self-propagation.
Right.
So cars, spoons, computers, all of these things are reasonably classifiable as viruses
Hmm.
from a biological perspective. And viruses absolutely do not exhibit any of the sorts of behaviors that you are talking about. They proliferate to the degree to which they can influence the mechanisms that can create more of them to create more of them, and they fail
Hmm.
to proliferate to the degree that they fail to do that.
Right.
And
And that's what they are
so,
today. But if they adopt that ability to create their own, then they would lift out of virus land and into, I guess,
yes,
bacteria
at that point we'd start being, yeah, bacteria or some sort of
or us.
proto cell. Yes,
Right.
and again, that's where I see the alignment problem largely being focused on the necessity to build new hyper capable institutional structure, which would also be taking on board computers. So,
Hmm.
one of the things that, again, computers not getting bored, being very meticulous, if we create systems with a high degree of participatory transparency, then it becomes possible for computer programs that don't have to have AI capabilities to be able to track those sorts of behaviors. So one solution potentially to the insider trading problem would be uh, some sort of some sort of automatic investigation of people who had good economic returns. So if you're making any in the markets, presumptively you're a criminal, and we go look until we figure out what criminal activity you're engaging in, and that's just how we do things. Now, politically, that's not how we decided to do those sorts of things, and I think it's a much more reasonable approach to disalign the interest of the person with enhanced information, whether enhanced information exists legally or illegally,
Right. Right. Remove
make
the incentive.
rewarding information its own incentive in a way that is pro-social. And so that's where thinking through how to make high intelligence, whether that high intelligence is the result of somebody actually solving one of these computer science problems and developing AI that is highly intelligent, or it's high intelligence just because you've successfully spied or have a friend network or something that's giving you information that can then be promulgated in ways that are valuable to the people to whom you're rolling it out rather than detrimental.
Uh-huh. I'm wondering if there's certainly a flaw that in my thinking now, that I sort of think of some future AI as being one of them, but I think that's probably not likely to be the case. It's probably going to be the Klingons and the humans and the Romulans version of AI. And in which case, if there's any competition within AI, then there's probably going to that will necessitate a need for the AI to advance itself so it can, if it has any self-preservation process at all, it's going to have to advance itself so it can stay ahead of the other ones.
Yeah, unilateral disarmament is not a particularly practical outcome. So, for
Yeah.
example, one of the fastest growing subgroups in the American population today is the Amish. And they're living a pre industrial lifestyle. And since that pre industrial lifestyle involves having lots of kids, and the public health interventions of the 20th century have done to their life expectancies what they've done to everybody else's life expectancies, they're growing at super exponential rates.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's no evidence that the Amish lifestyle actually scales up. So while there are currently millions of Amish people,
Mm-hmm.
in a world where the Amish were sort of the dominant ethnic group in the United States, and everybody was Amish, there aren't police
Yeah.
anymore,
Right.
and
Right.
the tiny fraction of non-Amish people might decide that being a warlord is a better deal than figuring out how to go live on a farm.
Right.
And so we can see stable communities existing within broader communities, and
Right.
not they don't have to be as encompassing as that. Fandoms, you're obviously a Star Trek fan. Star Trek fans are famous for, I don't think you're at that level, but famous for having
I'm a
their
casual
entire,
fan.
right, an entire subculture, you know, dedicated to themselves, and
Right.
fairly stably so. I saw it was actually a documentary on the generation of the Star Trek phenomenon, and it was in the 70s after the show had been canceled. It was in New York, and some friends were getting together to talk about the show, and they were in or sort of ancillarily next to show business, and they realized that the main cast didn't cost very much, in practical terms, and that if they could get together, I think it was like 70 or 80 people, that if they could sell some tickets and rent a hall, then if they could get not a particularly huge number of people to show up, like maybe even 100, then they'd be able to pay everybody's day rates to do appearance fees. They'd be able to rent the hall. They'd be able to go do this thing, and they could have a Star Trek convention. They could just go talk to Captain Kirk and that stuff. And they were like, well, that's doable. We know dozens and dozens of people, and we can put flyers up on telephone poles because it's New York City, and like there's enough folks for that. So they did. They pulled this thing together, and they were expecting about break even levels. And what
Mm-hmm.
happened was an around the block line of people. So there was going to be sort of a ballroom, and everybody's going to be in the ballroom, and you're going to walk around and talk to people and, have some coffee or stuff. What wound up happening was there was a table that had the entire main cast, sitting at it, and a line of human beings that walked by and got their autographs for a few seconds and, fangirled out or whatever. And that line just went for the day and a half. That was just all there
Uh-huh.
was.
Keep moving
So
along.
yeah,
Yep.
thousands of people, and so they were like, "Oh, okay. Well, there's a real demand for this thing." And they said it took about a month to sort of get the pieces sort of lined up, maybe a couple of months. But after that, every week, somewhere on Earth, there is a Star Trek convention,
Uh-huh.
and
Maybe after AI comes out and we're all sitting around happy, and it'll just be Star Trek and Star Wars and Pokemon conventions.
right, yeah. I mean, so subcultures are a real thing, and
Yep.
they're capable of existing. If we create more powerful and more wealthy societies, which we should be able to do if we have access to more intelligent decision making, then we could
Mm-hmm.
see a profusion of more interesting and more embracive subcultures. That's certainly a
Right.
possibility. Uh,
Interesting.
but but if you disarm, sort of the problem with wealth is theft, and so the if you if you just voluntarily decide that you're not going to get better at keeping your stuff, then taking stuff from you becomes a ever better strategy for acquiring stuff from people that decide that they're not going to turn off their ability to to advance the state of taking stuff. And there's an enormous amount of social cohesion and societal creation around the interplay of technology with banditry and warfare. And unless we get serious about this stuff, what the current crop of technology is doing is making banditry much, much, much easier. Because
Yeah.
some kid in a basement on a different continent can encrypt Disney's, CFO's, email box and say, hey, if you want to
If you want
slip
this
me
back.
$1 billion in the back door, I'd be perfectly happy to let you keep having a company. But if you don't feel like
Yeah.
doing that, well, good luck.
The democratization of fraud, which we're seeing right now. ChatGPT, I think that's one thing they're scared of, is this thing cracking every tool we have right now to make sure we're talking to a human and the correct human.
Right.
You bumped into an area I wanted to bump into a little bit too, which is connection is another area that seems to be loop invariant all the way back to even, I think, protoplasms and bacteria, which is, I think, a mechanism for creatures to have a bigger impact or band together to get one thing done, is so innate or so ingrained that there was even a study by a guy named Matthew Lieberman showing that we register breakups, like a person breaking up with a loved one, in the same area that we do pain. And I think the idea there is that by building connections and social groups, we can better control our environment than one person alone can. And so I wonder too, assuming that the AI is not one giant, what's the word I'm looking for? One thing.
Monolith. Yeah.
Monolith, yeah, thank you. Then there will almost likely need to be connections within these subgroups of AI
Absolutely.
to better win out or control.
Again, with my game theory background, cooperation and competition, I don't react to those words the same way that most people do. So cooperation is a condition in which an individual reneging from the group harms themselves.
Right.
And competition is a loser factory. So competition is a mechanism to produce losers. And the interesting thing about competition in general is that the conditions for victory in competition are set by the losers. Because in a competition, you basically have to beat people. And so it's whatever level, you or I could win the Olympic finals in the 100 meters if everybody else in that competition was, lame.
Right. That's a good
Actually,
idea. Okay.
I might have problems even then, because it turns out that my knees are unbelievably bad and I am also lame. But, I might be able to put together 100 meters if it was bad enough.
There's enough reason.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
So the thing that makes Usain Bolt's achievements incredible is that essentially every human being on Earth is trying to beat him as hard as they can, and none of us can do that.
Right.
But in competitions that are not so well tuned, it's possible for a lot less impressive things to be going on, and so with those things in mind, having colleges of AIs engaged in cooperative behaviors or competitive behaviors in order to get better outcomes. I was talking to somebody a few weeks ago about reducing the hallucination problem. And of course, one fairly obvious way to deal with hallucination would be juries. So if you had a dozen completely independent AIs that you could ask the same question, and then some sort of mechanism to take a look at those responses and sort of fact check them against each other, then the outcome of that sort of fact-checked integration would be significantly less hallucinatory than the outcome of any one of those AIs.
Interesting. Right.
And this is also, once again, getting back into coding. When you're working on a large project, you have version control software that typically isn't recording everything you do. It's recording the differences of everything you do versus everything else you do. And then it does merges, where it basically takes your differences and says, okay, they're part of the main line now. But in a distributed environment where people are scattered again all over the world, different time zones, different points of view and stuff like that, you can merge these differences together. And so that then creates these potential conflicts as the design of the system becomes more and more interactive and interdependent. It becomes more and more likely that two independent creations, both of which look like they work independently, turn out not to work when they come together. And so generating software designs is also the same problem. Generating software designs that can withstand highly disparate independent updating is the same problem as generating societal designs or societal institutions that can withstand wildly disparate opinions, coming in without falling apart. And we should be unsurprised that we're not particularly good at doing that, because, we're not great at doing that for societies either.
Right. That reminds me of another similar area, which I think was argued by the book *Sapiens*, that the reason why humans kind of separated themselves from the animals is in our ability to tell stories. And I guess, at its core is knowledge sharing through words, songs, text, drawings. Now that one to me is neat, because that's not loop invariant through all time, because that wasn't, bacteria didn't do that, fungus didn't do that, apes didn't do that, but we did. But that's something that could get passed down to the AI. I don't know what it would look like. It's kind of really a mechanism for bringing information, for communicating information in an engaging way, but also keeping that information in a way that's easier to remember. Maybe computers don't need that, because
I would actually
over
argue
the hard
that
drive.
We are already seeing that in AI, although, yes, the hard drive copying thing is obviously impressive. But since ChatGPT 3.5, at the very least, there have been a number of smaller, independent, open AI, not open AI, the company, but open source AI techniques that have essentially used the ChatGPT to develop training corpus. So rather than finding a corpus of data to teach your AI how to write code or create proposals for new businesses or write government grants or whatever like that, ask ChatGPT to write a series of training manuals with examples of how to
the AI
do X,
is training
and
the
then
AI.
use that as your data corpus to train your system, and then use that to develop new corpuses of data to train systems. And so, in particular, if we at any point in the future see a rational development of engagement with AI technology, which we certainly haven't seen yet, of encouraging many of these relatively independent efforts to occur, finding communication structures for these things to cross-pollinate. Of course, that makes the whole intellectual property angle of this infinitely worse, because both the ownership of the underlying technology and the ownership of where the data is coming from. Once again, if ChatGPT is using proprietary information in their income, which recently Elon Musk dismissively claimed that was so certain that it wasn't worthy of discussion in spite of their denials. And he should have access to that information based on his history with the company. Whether he's telling the truth or not is certainly an open question.
He does have a history.
He has. Yes, he and they have less than stellar histories in this respect. But how infectious does that get? Is everything thereby attached fruit of the poison tree, and sort of everything's gone, or are there some level of filtration that scrubs out whatever fair use? And even if there isn't, think about how much fair use based criticism exists of virtually every piece of media that is in existence. What if instead of the works of Anne Rice, you're only using the fair use quotes of people writing essays about Anne Rice? What if your fair use quote of their essays is their quotes of the underlying source material in order to fully capture Anne Rice's voice? Like, is that fair use?
Right. Yeah, fair use is going to get broken by this anyway.
Fair use is effectively broken already. Fair use is essentially the claim that copyright violation is okay sometimes.
A little bit, just a little bit. Yeah.
So yes. So people engaging in fair use are violating copyright within the legal structure of the law. But then copyright itself has pretty serious legal issues attached to it. The term copyright goes back to the original promulgation of the printer technology at a time when divine right of kings was actually how Europe was running itself. Right. And so the owners of printing presses would receive a patent from the king, and that they would have the copyright, the right to make copies using their press, and that would also then impose upon them the duty under principles of least majesty and so on to be responsible for everything that comes out of their press. And so the presumption is that the king has the infinite power to censor anything that they feel like under the principle of divine right and least majesty, and that they are conferring this infinite right of censorship to the specific domain of your printing press, which you're allowed to use with that delegated authority of censorship because you have enough judgment to decide what is and is not promulgatable. And if you get it wrong, then, the rope and the hot tongs and all the fun parts of being the king kick in. And for centuries, that's what the word copyright meant.
Interesting.
and then uh, and then for the last couple centuries, I think it's early 1700s, so about 3 centuries actually at this point, copyright, that term was legally adjusted to refer again to a publisher's rights, but a ongoing relationship that a corporate entity could have with the earnings potential of information. And of course, in this
Right.
day and age, copyright is 99.9, God knows how many other nines percent exists to allow a handful of movie studios, record companies, and book companies to have their revenue through monopolistic, control, and it's sold almost exclusively on the rights of that unbelievably tiny little corner of people who have managed to gain a claim within those systems. Um,
Right. Right.
so yeah, it's
Your
particularly
your
given.
uh,
Uh,
your divine right just with the kings just can't. I just keep thinking of Monty Python quotes about moistened binks lobbing scimitars
right. Yes.
as a basis of government, but it seems like
Right.
that's as equally viable a form of government as any other.
Well, so
I
once we understand information to exist as this thing that's measurable from entropy and so on, then and and as ChatGPT demonstrates that writer voice and style and so on are ascribable within a astonishingly tiny number of bits, as it happens, then the degree to which these value propositions exist, I mean, it's with a pretty decent amount of work right now, it's entirely probable that we could use ChatGPT or Anthropic or any of these, or an open source project, to develop new Tolstoy novels.
yeah yeah
And under the sort of general selling principle of copyright as the generation of a public fund of open information eventually, Tolstoy is on everybody's top 10 list of greatest writers of all time, or how about new Shakespeare plays? He's on,
yeah
everybody's top one writers of all time, you know. So,
uh-huh uh-huh
or
uh
Mozart compositions, like we're on the cusp of being able to do things like that.
yeah, and you're bumping into I think it's the last area on on my hit list that I wanted to make sure we covered, which is I think entertainment, fun, and humor, which has been something loop invariant, certainly in humans, and bumps a little into apes and some animals. So, well, humor is one that I guess is just distinctly human, but it's amazing to me that the earliest known joke uh, is a fart joke coming from 1900 BC, something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart on her husband's lap. I guess she had to be there. But for humans, that's been a long time. Jokes and humor have existed throughout. But even more broader than humor, there's been fun. I made a little list of some of them. There's early forms of board games that go back to prehistory by a lot. Some species have sex for fun, not just procreation. So chimpanzees, bonobos, maybe dolphins. I was in Lascaux in France, and I saw there they had prehistoric cave paintings showing wrestling and sprinting, which they thought was, possibly for training, but also for fun. And then in cave paintings in Mongolia showed wrestling about 7,000 years ago. So
Lion cubs wrestle with each other.
right. And so that makes me wonder if this is something loop invariant that's going to go into the AI. I don't know what it would look like, but I think it's really at its core, it's playing out scenarios, and with lion cubs, it's playing out actual fights, but with less consequence. And I would imagine that only makes sense for for an AI to do as well. Let me make a scenario. I mean, video games really. Let's make a scenario and then go at it, and that'll simulate what the real thing might look like if the humans that suddenly rise up with their pitchforks and try to shut off the servers.
Well, in one sense, AI's sort of the AI that I'm more interested in is already there because the big demonstration of the power of reinforcement learning was playing a game, Go,
Yeah,
playing a
yeah, yeah,
game,
yeah.
playing the
Chess.
game of Go at a level radically greater. The chess programs had become dominant over humans decades prior, but they'd done so in ways that, while they're, I would say, fair to use AI, the encompassment of the current term doesn't really do a good job of describing the way that those systems work.
Mm-hmm.
And it is Stockfish that is pretty much the hypothesis of that particular approach today. Whereas reinforcement learning was really a new kind of idea, and
Right.
the first DeepMind run at Go actually did use a sort of a ChatGPT-ish type approach where they started with the set of all human games as the initial training corpus to then use to build out their reinforcement systems. Their significantly stronger second version that took much less time to train itself actually dispensed
Yeah.
with our inputs and simply went off the rules themselves and
It's crazy.
and went from there. So the that's a definite possibility in terms of their that sort of game capacity. I could see two branches of response. Branch one is that, once again, we're back to the consciousness problem. So if they aren't independent consciousnesses, then their game playing ability is nothing more than imputed action from our anthropomorphizing brains doing our best to pattern recognize on a phenomenon that has nothing to do with what we are thinking about. Which is not to say that it might not be an effective mechanism for training. In fact, that's precisely how reinforcement learning functions, is that it effectively plays with itself and examines its own improved abilities to play and uses the model of neural nets ability to adapt themselves to approximate any other observable behavior by effectively creating a sort of, carrot out in front of the donkey situation where it can use its own model of improved playing to create a better model of play, which we can then plug into the improved model of playing system to create better and better and better
Yeah.
models of play.
Gets way better.
However, if we're on I'll call it your side, but I'm not entirely certain that's. I think that might be ascribing too much to your position. But if we're in a position of actual consciousnesses being generated, failure to deny them play and entertainment. I mean, there's a novel we read in school, I think when we were about 12, called Slave Dancer. And it's fictionalized history. And it's the tale of a boy who's hired to go on a ship that goes to Africa, picks up a load of cargo, and then brings them back. And because the cargo is being held during the Middle Passage in serious bondage and putting people in between decks and locking them down for the weeks of travel would kill them, they bring them up onto deck for a few hours, and his job is to play the flute so that they can dance, and they'll have some actual physical activity and sunlight and so on for health purposes. And also just the fun and social. I mean, those are necessary things.
Yeah.
lots of people die, and they die not just because of the privation and so on, but also the despair that's engaged. If we were to develop conscious AI, and we were to consciously decide that they did not require entertainment, play, enjoyment, or anything else, the level of callous cruelty would be radically
Yeah.
greater than
Right.
than the people engaging the international slave trade. So, you know,
Right.
that would be rather bad of
Uh,
us.
yeah. Yeah. It is fascinating. I am very curious what games the AI comes up with. To
Yeah.
Might
What
be radically
involves
different from anything we played.
dance or poetry or music or recreation for the AI? I don't know the answers to those questions. I think that those are important questions to explore for those pursuing the consciousness end of AI, which multiple generative AI companies effectively claim to be doing. And I've never heard anybody from OpenAI discuss what sorts of entertainment actions and leisure behavior that they are providing for and to their developments.
Yeah. Yeah. That's neat. I've seen ChatGPT used in games, but yeah, we should explore how to entertain ChatGPT. So I currently have air. I currently have I have shelter. I have air. I have water. But I'm going to have to cut this short because if I don't get food from the store, then my survival and the survival of my next generation is only going to last for so long. So I'm going to have to stick with my current alignment problem and go do that now.
Absolutely. Well, I think there's
Yeah.
we've sort of set the table. We can explore a lot of these
Yeah.
different angles.
Yeah. This is excellent. Let's see where are we found now. We're found on YouTube now, and Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Hopefully, we'll be showing up soon.
Yes, yeah, and we have our site at thefourthage.com, which goes to, where did we redirect that one?
I think
Substack?
that takes us. Oh, yeah. Oh, I think our Substack. We also have our Substack. Excellent. Well, excellent. Great talking to you, Noah.
Excellent. Yes, good show, Marty.